Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of a man's entire life. When you've been written off by the world, forgotten and feared in equal measure, a single moment of grace can feel like a miracle. Boone Maddox was drowning in the Sweetwater River that July day in 1884. The big cowboy everyone feared was about to meet his end in those rushing waters. His horse had stumbled at the crossing, and now the current was dragging him under. Then a 9-year-old girl named Josie threw him a rope. She was barefoot, small as a bird, and had every reason to let the notorious Boone Maddox drown, but she didn't. What happened after she pulled him from that river would become the most talked-about story in the Wyoming Territory. But what drove a little girl to save a man the whole frontier feared? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory in 1884 was not a place for the weak-hearted. It was a land where winter could kill you as easily as a rattlesnake, where the nearest law might be 3 days' hard ride away, and where a man's reputation often meant the difference between respect and a shallow grave. In this unforgiving landscape, Boone Maddox had carved out a name that mothers whispered to frighten stubborn children into obedience. Standing 6'4" in his worn boots, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, Boone carried himself like a man who had learned early that the world would take everything from you if you let it. His face bore the weathered lines of 34 hard years, scars from bar fights, creases from squinting into too many harsh suns, and eyes the color of winter storms that seemed to look right through a person. Those who had crossed him spoke in hushed tones about fists like sledgehammers and a temper that could ignite faster than dry grass in August. But reputations, like the men who carry them, can be deceiving things. The leather journal tucked inside Boone's saddlebags told a different story than the one whispered in saloons. Its pages, yellowed and soft from handling, contained careful sketches of wildflowers pressed between the sheets, notes about weather patterns, and observations about the small kindnesses he had witnessed in his travels. A woman sharing her last biscuit with a stranger, a rancher taking in an orphaned colt. Simple acts that somehow made the brutality of frontier life bearable. The journal was his secret, a window into a heart that the world had taught him to keep locked away. On that particular July morning, before the river changed everything, Boone had been riding through Sweetwater Springs with no intention of staying. The town was like a dozen others. He had passed through a collection of weathered buildings, clinging to life along a dusty main street, with a general store, a saloon, and a church that looked like it was losing its battle against the wind. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were either welcomed with cautious hospitality or watched with suspicious eyes. The Sweetwater River cut through the valley like a silver scar, its waters running swift and cold from the mountain snowmelt. Most times of the year, it was shallow enough to ford without trouble, but the spring rains had been heavy, and the current ran stronger than it appeared from the bank. Boone's bay gelding, a sure-footed animal that had carried him through countless miles of rough country, stepped into the water with confidence. That confidence proved misplaced. The riverbed dropped away suddenly, and the horse stumbled, throwing Boone from the saddle into the rushing current. The water hit him like a physical blow, cold enough to steal his breath and strong enough to tumble him like a leaf in a gale. His heavy boots and sodden clothing dragged him down, and for the first time in years, Boone Maddox felt genuine fear. Not the quick spike of adrenaline that came with a gunfight or a bar brawl, but the slow, cold certainty that he might not see another sunset. He fought the current with everything he had, his powerful arms cutting through the water, but the river seemed determined to claim him. His lungs burned as he struggled to keep his head above the surface, and dark spots began to dance at the edges of his vision. This was how it would end, he thought with bitter irony, not in some dramatic showdown with a faster gun, but drowned like a fool who couldn't judge the depth of a river crossing. That's when he heard the voice. Mister, grab hold. Through the water, streaming from his eyes, Boone saw a length of rope splash into the river beside him. His hands closed around it instinctively, and he felt himself being pulled not by some burly rancher or group of townsmen, but by a slip of a girl who couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds soaking wet. Josie McCall stood braced against a weathered fence post, her bare feet dug into the muddy bank, every muscle in her small frame straining against the rope. She was 9 years old, with sun-bleached hair that hung in tangles around her shoulders and eyes, the color of spring grass that held a determination far beyond her years. Her dress, faded from many washings, clung to her thin frame, and Boone could see her arms trembling with the effort of hauling a man 3 times her size to safety. "Hold on tight, mister," she called out, her voice steady despite the strain. "I've got you." Inch by painful inch, she dragged him toward the shore, using every trick she had learned from helping her father with the farm work leverage, patience, and a stubbornness that ran in the McCall bloodline like a river itself. When Boone's boots finally found purchase on the rocky bottom, he stumbled forward, coughing up river water and gasping for breath. "You all right, mister?" Josie asked, dropping the rope and moving closer with the fearless curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that some men were dangerous. Boone looked at her, really looked, and felt something shift inside his chest. Here was a child who had risked her own safety to save a stranger, a man whose very presence in town had probably sent her neighbors scurrying behind locked doors. She stood there, dripping wet from where the river had splashed her, studying him with those remarkable green eyes, waiting to see if he needed more help. "I—" Boone's voice came out as a croak, and he cleared his throat. "I reckon I owe you my life, little miss." Josie tilted her head, considering this. "Mama says we all owe each other help when we can give it. You would have done the same for me, wouldn't you?" The simple question hit Boone harder than the river current had. Would he have? He wanted to believe he would, but honest reflection forced him to admit he might have hesitated, might have calculated the risk, might have looked the other way if it meant avoiding trouble. This child had done what he, for all his size and strength, might not have had the courage to do. "Yes," he said finally, meaning it. "Yes, I would have." She smiled at this, a gap-toothed grin that transformed her serious face into something bright and open. "I'm Josie McCall. What's your name?" For a moment, Boone considered giving a false name. His reputation had a way of preceding him, and he had no desire to frighten the girl who had just saved his life. But something about her direct gaze made deception impossible. Boone Maddox. If the name meant anything to her, she didn't show it. "Well, Mr. Maddox, you look like you could use some hot coffee and a warm place to sit. Mama's got both back at our place." Before Boone could protest, she had gathered up the rope, which, he now noticed, was attached to an old well pulley mechanism and was leading him up the bank toward a narrow path that wound through the cottonwood trees. His horse, having found its own way to shore downstream, followed along with the resigned air of an animal that had seen its rider make poor decisions before. The McCall homestead sat in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the river, and Boone's experienced eye took in the details with the automatic assessment of a man who had learned to read trouble in the landscape. The house was small but well built, with a stone foundation that spoke of permanence and care. A kitchen garden showed recent tending, though the vegetables looked sparse, as if the family was making do with less than they needed. The barn was solid enough, but he could see places where boards had been patched with whatever wood was available, and the fence around the chicken coop bore signs of recent repair. It was the home of people who worked hard and took pride in what they had, but who were clearly struggling to hold on to it. "Mama!" Josie called out as they approached the house. "I've brought company." The door opened, and Boone found himself looking at a woman who was unmistakably Josie's mother. Sarah McCall had the same green eyes and stubborn chin as her daughter, though her hair was a darker shade of brown and pulled back in a practical bun. She was probably in her early 30s, though the lines around her eyes spoke of worries that aged a person faster than years. Her dress was simple but clean, with small patches that had been mended with careful stitches. When her eyes fell on Boone, he saw her stiffen slightly, not with fear, exactly, but with the wariness of a woman who had learned to be careful around strangers, especially large men with hard faces and guns on their hips. "Mama, this is Mr. Maddox," Josie announced proudly. "He fell in the river, and I pulled him out with Papa's rope." Sarah's expression shifted from wariness to concern. "My goodness, are you hurt? Josie, get some towels. Mr. Maddox, please come in and get warm." As Boone stepped into the modest home, he was struck by its atmosphere of quiet dignity. The furniture was simple but well cared for, the floors swept clean, and the smell of baking bread filled the air. A collection of books sat on a shelf near the window, and he could see children's drawings pinned to the wall beside the kitchen table. It was a home where love lived, even if money did not. "I'm grateful for your kindness, Mom," Boone said, accepting the towel Sarah offered him. "Your daughter saved my life. I won't forget that." Something in his tone must have convinced her of his sincerity, because Sarah's posture relaxed slightly. "Josie has always been drawn to helping folks in trouble. Sometimes I worry she'll get herself into danger with that soft heart of hers." Boone looked at the girl, who was bustling around the kitchen with the competence of someone twice her age, and felt that strange shifting in his chest again. "She's got courage, that's for certain, and a good heart. You've raised her well. I can't take all the credit for that," Sarah said quietly. "Her father," she stopped, and Boone saw a shadow pass across her face. "Well, he had a lot to do with shaping her character." The past tense didn't escape Boone's notice, and neither did the way Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to touch a pale band of skin on her ring finger where a wedding band had once rested. He filed the observation away, along with a dozen other small details that painted a picture of a family dealing with loss and hardship. "Where is Papa?" Josie asked suddenly, looking up from the coffee pot she was tending. "He's been gone an awful long time." Sarah's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He had some business to attend to, sweetheart. He'll be back when he can." The lie came easily, too easily, and Boone recognized the sound of a story that had been told many times. Whatever had happened to Josie's father, it wasn't the simple business trip Sarah pretended it was. And judging by the worry lines around her eyes and the way she watched the road through the window, Sarah knew it too. As the afternoon wore on, Boone found himself reluctant to leave. The warmth of the little house, the easy chatter of Josie as she told him about her chickens and her lessons at the schoolhouse, and the quiet strength of Sarah as she went about her daily tasks, all of it felt like a balm to something deep inside him that had been wounded for so long he had forgotten it was there. But as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Boone knew he couldn't impose on their hospitality any longer. He rose from the kitchen table where they had shared a simple but nourishing supper, reaching into his pocket for coins to leave for the meal. "Please," Sarah said, holding up a hand to stop him. "You don't owe us anything." Josie was glad to help, and so was I. "At least, let me chop some firewood before I go," Boone insisted. "Or mend that fence rail I noticed was loose." Something in his voice, perhaps the genuine desire to be useful, to give something back, made Sarah reconsider. "Well, if you're sure it's no trouble, that fence rail has been bothering me for weeks." Boone spent the next hour working in the yard, and as he split wood and hammered nails, he became aware of eyes watching him from the road. A group of men on horseback had paused at the edge of the property, and though they made no move to approach, their presence felt like a threat. When he looked directly at them, they moved on, but the feeling of menace lingered. "Who were those men?" he asked Sarah when he came back to the house. Her face had gone pale. "Nobody important, just some of the ranch hands from the big spreads they ride through sometimes." Another lie, and this one had fear behind it. Boone was beginning to understand that the McCall's troubles went deeper than a missing husband and tight finances. Someone was watching them, and Sarah was afraid. As darkness settled over the valley and Boone prepared to make camp by the river, Josie appeared at his elbow with something wrapped in a clean cloth. "For your breakfast tomorrow," she said shyly, pressing the bundle into his hands. "Mama made extra biscuits." Boone accepted the gift with the solemnity it deserved. "Thank you kindly, Miss Josie. You and your mother have been more than generous to a stranger." "You're not a stranger anymore," she said matter-of-factly. "You're our friend." And as Boone rode away into the gathering darkness, her words echoed in his mind. When was the last time someone had called him friend? When was the last time he had felt the pull of belonging somewhere, of being needed for something other than his skill with a gun or his willingness to do violence? He made camp that night, within sight of the McCall homestead, telling himself it was just a convenient spot with good water and grass for his horse. But as he sat by his small fire, staring up at the stars, he found his thoughts returning again and again to a gap-toothed smile and a pair of green eyes that had looked at him without fear. Something was wrong in this peaceful valley, something that had Sarah McCall jumping at shadows and lying to her daughter about where her father had gone. And whatever it was big enough to make grown men ride past a homestead with the calculating stare of wolves sizing up prey. Boone opened his worn leather journal and began to write by firelight, his pencil moving slowly across the page. But for once, he wasn't sketching flowers or recording acts of kindness. Instead, he found himself drawing the face of a little girl who had thrown him a rope when he was drowning, and wondering what he could do to repay a debt that seemed to grow larger with every passing hour. Boone woke before dawn to the sound of horses approaching. Years of sleeping light had trained his ears to distinguish between the casual clip-clop of a traveling rider and the purposeful thunder of men riding with intent. This was the latter. He rolled from his bedroll with the fluid motion of a man accustomed to waking to trouble, his hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip. Through the morning mist rising from the river, he could see riders surrounding the McCall homestead. 5 men, maybe 6, sitting their horses in a loose circle around the property like they owned it. The sound of raised voices carried across the distance, and Boone's jaw tightened when he heard Sarah's voice, tight with fear, but still defiant. He saddled his horse quickly, every movement deliberate and economical, then rode toward the confrontation with the measured pace of a man who had learned that arriving too fast could escalate a situation beyond repair. As he drew closer, the scene became clearer. The men were professional intimidators, not common drifters or cattle rustlers, but the kind of hired muscle that money could buy when subtlety was no longer an option. Their leader sat easy in his saddle, a lean man with silver-streaked hair and cold eyes that missed nothing. He wore a black suit despite the early hour, and his boots gleamed with fresh polish. This was a man who valued appearances, who understood that power was as much about perception as force. "Mrs. McCall," the man was saying in a voice smooth as silk over steel, "my employer's patience isn't unlimited. You've had 3 months to consider our generous offer." "I told you before, Mr. Crane," Sarah replied, standing in her doorway with Josie pressed close behind her. "This land isn't for sale. It's been in my husband's family for 15 years. Silas Crane, for that was the name that came with the reputation, smiled without warmth. "Ah, yes, your husband, still away on business, is he? Funny how his business seems to keep him away for such long stretches." The way he said it made Boone's blood run cold. There was knowledge behind those words, and malice. This wasn't a man making inquiries about buying property. This was a predator toying with his prey. "What my husband does is no concern of yours," Sarah said, but Boone could hear the tremor in her voice. "Oh, but it is my concern, Mrs. McCall. You see, when a man disappears, really disappears, it creates certain legal complications. Questions about property ownership, about a woman's right to make decisions regarding land that might technically belong to a man who's no longer able to claim it." Josie stepped out from behind her mother, and Boone saw her hand go instinctively to her dress pocket. The gesture was quick, protective, as if she were guarding something precious. "Papa's coming back," she said with the fierce certainty of a child who refused to accept what the adults around her already knew. He promised he would. Crane's attention shifted to the girl, and his smile became something uglier. Of course he did, little one. Fathers make all sorts of promises. That was when Boone rode into the yard, his horse's hooves striking the packed earth with deliberate loudness. The sound drew every eye, and he saw recognition flicker across Crane's face. Not surprise, exactly, but the calculation of a man reassessing his position. "Morning, folks," Boone said mildly, touching the brim of his hat to Sarah while keeping his eyes on Crane. "I was just riding by and heard voices. Thought I'd stop and see if everything was all right." "Everything's fine here, stranger," one of Crane's men said, his hand drifting toward his gun. "Just having a friendly conversation with the lady." Boone's gaze moved to the speaker, a thick-set man with scars on his knuckles and the kind of face that had stopped too many fists with insufficient success. "Didn't look particularly friendly from where I was sitting," Boone observed. 6 armed men surrounding a woman and child. Most folks would call that something else entirely. "Most folks would mind their own business," Crane said smoothly, but Boone caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes measured distances and angles. This was a man who had survived by reading situations correctly, and what he was reading now was making him recalculate his approach. "Funny thing about business," Boone replied, dismounting with unhurried precision. "Sometimes what looks like someone else's business turns out to be your own, especially when it involves folks who've shown you kindness." He stood now in the yard, his presence somehow making the space feel smaller, more contained. The morning sun struck his face at an angle that emphasized the scars and hard lines, and Crane's men shifted uneasily in their saddles. They had expected to intimidate a defenseless woman and child, not to face down someone who looked like he'd been carved from the same violent stone as themselves. "Mrs. McCall," Boone said without taking his eyes off Crane, "these gentlemen giving you trouble?" Sarah's voice was steady when she answered. "Mr. Crane here seems to think I should sell my land to his employer. I've tried to explain that it's not for sale." "Ah," Boone nodded, as if this explained everything. "And I suppose Mr. Crane's employer is the type who doesn't take no for an answer." Crane's smile had disappeared entirely. "Mr. Maddox, isn't it?" "Yes, I know who you are. Your reputation precedes you, as they say. But reputation and reality don't always align, do they? Perhaps you should consider whether this particular fight is worth the cost." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Boone felt the familiar cold calm that came over him in moments like these. It was a feeling he had tried to leave behind, the icy clarity that made violence seem not just possible but inevitable. But some things, he reflected, were worth fighting for. "Mr. Crane," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made smart men listen carefully, "I've found that reputation and reality have a way of converging when the situation calls for it. And this situation seems to be calling for something." The silence stretched taut between them, filled with the weight of unspoken threats and calculated risks. Crane's men were good, Boone could see that, but they were hired muscle, not men with personal investment in the outcome. They would fight if ordered, but they wouldn't die for Crane's ambitions. That gave Boone an advantage, though he hoped it wouldn't come to testing it. "Papa left me this," Josie said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She pulled something from her pocket, a tarnished deputy's badge that caught the morning light. "He said if anyone ever tried to hurt us, I should remember that he was a lawman, and lawmen don't run from bullies." The badge changed everything. Crane's face went white, then flushed with anger as he realized what the child had just revealed. A deputy sheriff didn't just disappear on business. A deputy sheriff with a badge had authority, had connections, had the backing of territorial law. And if that deputy sheriff had mysteriously vanished while investigating certain land acquisitions— "Where did you get that?" Crane demanded, his composure finally cracking. "I told you," Josie said, holding the badge protectively against her chest. "Papa gave it to me before he left. He said I should keep it safe until he came back. Boone felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The mysterious disappearance, the pressure to sell, the legal complications, Crane had mentioned it, all painted a picture of corruption that went deeper than simple land grabbing. Deputy Tom McCall had been investigating something, and that investigation had cost him dearly. "Seems to me," Boone said slowly, "that this conversation has run its course. Mrs. McCall has made her position clear, and I reckon these gentlemen have heard her answer." Crane gathered himself, his politician's mask sliding back into place. "Of course, we're reasonable men after all, but Mrs. McCall should understand that our offer won't remain open indefinitely. Circumstances have a way of changing, and not always for the better." He wheeled his horse around, but not before fixing Boone with a stare that promised future reckoning. "Mr. Maddox, I hope your stay in our territory proves educational. Sometimes the lessons are harder than others." As the riders disappeared down the road, Boone turned to find Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Fear, gratitude, and something else, a calculation as careful as Crane's had been, but warmer, more hopeful. "Thank you," she said simply, "but you should know what you've gotten yourself into. This won't end here." Boone looked at Josie, still clutching her father's badge, and felt something settle inside him like a key turning in a lock. "No," he agreed. "I don't reckon it will. But some fights are worth having, and some debts are worth paying." He had come to this valley by accident, saved by the courage of a child who had thrown him a rope when he was drowning. Now he found himself throwing his own rope to a family being pulled under by forces larger and more dangerous than any river current. The difference was, this time, he knew exactly what he was diving into. In the days that followed Crane's visit, a heavy quiet settled over the McCall homestead like dust after a windstorm. Sarah moved through her daily routines with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to function despite constant worry, while Josie watched the road with the patient vigilance of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Boone made himself useful in the way of men who understood that actions spoke louder than words. He mended the fence that had been troubling Sarah, replaced loose boards on the barn, and helped Josie tend to the chickens that provided the family with both eggs and a small income, when times were particularly tight. It was during one of these quiet morning chores that Sarah finally told him the truth about their circumstances. "Tom's been gone 4 months now," she said, hanging laundry on the line behind the house while Boone repaired a broken gate nearby. "He rode out one morning saying he had to check on something for the sheriff's office. Said he'd be back in a few days at most." Her hands stilled on the wet fabric, and Boone could see the weight of carrying this secret alone. "The last I heard from him was a letter sent from Cheyenne. He said he was following a lead about some irregularities in land sales, but that I shouldn't worry. That was 3.5 months ago." Boone set down his hammer and looked at her directly. "And you think whatever he was investigating got him into trouble?" "I know it did." Sarah's voice was flat with certainty. "Tom was careful, methodical. He wouldn't have stayed away this long unless something was preventing him from coming home. And now Crane shows up wanting to buy our land for half what it's worth, talking about legal complications and missing husbands." The bitter irony wasn't lost on either of them. Tom McCall had likely been investigating the very scheme that was now being used to pressure his own family. "What about the territorial marshal?" Boone asked. "Or the sheriff Tom worked for?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Sheriff Bradley retired suddenly 2 months ago. Moved back east, they say. The new sheriff is a man named Garrett Young, inexperienced and very interested in maintaining good relationships with the territory's prominent citizens. Citizens like whoever Crane represents." Boone absorbed this information, filing it away with everything else he'd observed. A careful web of corruption, with tentacles reaching into the very institutions meant to provide protection and justice. It was a familiar pattern, one he'd seen played out in other territories where money and influence mattered more than law and decency. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Yesterday, When you were in town getting supplies, a man came by. Said he was looking for work, but he spent an awful lot of time asking questions about you, about how long you planned to stay, whether you were just passing through. The news didn't surprise Boone, but it confirmed what he'd already suspected. Crane was having him watched, gathering information, looking for weaknesses or pressure points. It was the behavior of a man who preferred to solve problems with leverage rather than direct confrontation, but who wasn't afraid to escalate if necessary. What did you tell him? That you were a friend, helping out temporarily. But Josie, Sarah paused, glancing toward the house where her daughter was visible through the kitchen window, carefully counting eggs into a basket. Josie told him you were staying to protect us until her papa came home. She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Boone felt that familiar tightness in his chest when he thought about the girl's absolute faith in both her father's return and his own commitment to their safety. Children had a way of seeing the world in simple terms, good and bad, safe and dangerous, people who helped and people who hurt. In Josie's mind, he had crossed definitively into the category of protector, and that trust felt heavier than any gun he'd ever carried. She pawned her wedding ring yesterday, Sarah said quietly, nodding toward her bare ring finger, to buy flour and coffee. I told her we could make do with what we had, but she said we needed to be good hosts while you were helping us. The revelation hit Boone like a physical blow. He thought of the generous meals, the fresh coffee, the comfortable bed they'd offered him in the small room off the kitchen. All of it purchased with the sacrifice of what was probably Sarah's most precious possession, a symbol of happier times and lost love. Mrs. McCall, Sarah, I can't let you. You can and you will, she interrupted firmly. That ring was just metal and stones. What you're doing for us, the safety you're providing, that's worth more than any piece of jewelry. But Boone knew it wasn't just metal and stones. He'd seen the way her hand went unconsciously to that finger when she was worried or thinking about her husband. He'd noticed how she touched that pale band of skin like a talisman against fear. The ring had been her last tangible connection to Tom McCall, and she'd traded it for flour and coffee because she was too proud to let a guest go hungry in her home. That afternoon, while Sarah worked in her garden and Josie practiced her letters at the kitchen table, Boone rode into Sweetwater Springs. The town was bigger than it had appeared on his first ride, through a growing community that served the scattered ranches and mining claims in the surrounding valleys. The main street bustled with activity, and Boone noticed several well-dressed men who didn't look like local ranchers or miners. Crane's people, most likely, keeping watch and taking notes. His first stop was the general store, where he bought supplies with money from his own dwindling funds: coffee, flour, sugar, and a few other necessities that would help ease the burden on the McCall household. But his real destination was the small shop tucked between the barber shop and the newspaper office, identified by a simple sign reading "Timepieces and Fine Jewelry." The proprietor was a thin man with careful eyes who recognized quality when he saw it, both in customers and in merchandise. "You're looking for something particular?" he asked, his gaze taking in Boone's worn but well-maintained clothing, the expensive leather of his gun belt, the quiet confidence that marked him as someone with money to spend. "A wedding ring," Boone said. "Simple gold band, woman's size. Would have been pawned here recently by a lady with brown hair and green eyes." Understanding flickered in the jeweler's expression. "Ah, Mrs. McCall. Beautiful piece, that ring. Her husband had it made special when they married. Engraved inside with their initials and wedding date." He paused, studying Boone's face. "You wouldn't be the fellow who's been helping out at their place." News traveled fast in small towns, and Boone wasn't surprised his presence had been noted and discussed. "I am, and I'd like to buy that ring back." The transaction was completed quickly and quietly, the jeweler asking no questions beyond confirming the price. As Boone tucked the small wrapped package into his shirt pocket, he felt a presence behind him and turned to find one of Crane's watchers studying him through the shop window. The man made no attempt to hide his interest, even touching the brim of his hat in mocking acknowledgement when their eyes met. Let them watch, Boone thought. Let them wonder what he was planning, what resources he had, what he was willing to do to protect the family that had shown him kindness. Sometimes the best defense was to let your enemies know you weren't running scared. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table after supper, Boone placed the small package beside Sarah's coffee cup. She looked at it with confusion, then understanding. Then, something that might have been tears. "You didn't have to. We can't afford to." "It's already done," Boone said simply, "and it's where it belongs." Sarah opened the package with trembling fingers, and the simple gold band caught the lamplight like a small sun. When she slipped it back onto her finger, Boone saw her shoulders straighten, saw some essential part of herself settle back into place. "Thank you," she whispered. But Boone was looking at Josie, who was watching the scene with the deep seriousness of a child who understood more than adults realized. In her eyes, he saw approval, trust, and something else, the recognition that sometimes actions matter more than words, and that protecting people you care about means paying attention to the things that matter to them. Outside, the Wyoming wind whistled through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the darkness, Crane's men were probably watching and waiting. But inside the small house, 3 people sat in the warm circle of lamplight, and for the first time in months, Sarah McCall wore her wedding ring. The forged documents were discovered by accident, hidden in a place where honest men would never have thought to look. Josie found them while playing in the old oak tree that grew behind Peterson's abandoned claim, her sharp eyes spotting the oilskin packet wedged into a hollow in the trunk. To a 9-year-old, it was simply an interesting discovery. To Boone, examining the papers by lamplight that evening, it was evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple land grabbing. The documents were masterful forgeries, deeds, survey reports, and territorial registration papers that would have fooled most casual observers. But Boone had spent enough time in territorial offices to recognize the subtle inconsistencies. Ink that was too fresh for the claimed dates, survey marks that didn't match the territorial standard, in signatures that varied just enough to suggest the hand of a skilled but imperfect forger. What made them truly damning was their scope. According to these papers, Silas Crane's employer, a mining consortium called Mountain Territory Development, had legitimate claim to nearly 15,000 acres of the richest farmland and mining territory in the valley. Claims that superseded existing homestead rights, Mexican land grants, and even tribal territories that were supposedly protected by federal treaty. "This is how they're doing it," Boone explained to Sarah as they studied the documents spread across the kitchen table. "They're not just buying land from desperate families. They're creating false claims that make the original deeds worthless. When they take this to territorial court, it'll look like every homesteader in the valley is squatting on land that was never legally theirs." Sarah's face had gone pale as she read through the implications. "And Tom found out about this. That's why he went to Cheyenne to check the territorial records against these forgeries. Which means he probably found the proof needed to expose the whole scheme," Boone said grimly. "And Crane's people couldn't let that happen." The weight of this realization settled over them like a storm cloud. Tom McCall hadn't simply disappeared while investigating irregularities. He had uncovered evidence of a massive fraud, one that would have destroyed the lives of dozens of families and made certain powerful men incredibly wealthy. The kind of discovery that desperate people would kill to protect. Over the following days, Boone began reaching out carefully to other families in the valley, testing the waters to see who could be trusted and who might already be compromised. The task required delicacy. Too direct an approach might alert Crane's network, but too subtle, and he might miss potential allies who were simply too frightened to speak openly. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena Vasquez, whose family had worked a small ranch on the southern edge of the valley for 3 generations, approached Boone while he was buying supplies in town. She was a woman in her 50s, with steel grey hair and the weathered hands of someone who had spent her life working with horses and cattle. "Mr. Maddox," she said quietly, pretending to examine saddle leather while she spoke, "I hear you've been asking questions about land troubles." Boone's instincts prickled, but something in her manner suggested genuine concern rather than hostile curiosity. "I have an interest in seeing honest folks get fair treatment," he replied carefully. "My grandson Roberto works sometimes for the Territorial Surveyor's office in Cheyenne. Last month, he mentioned something strange. A man had come in, asking to examine old survey records, but the records he wanted to see had mysteriously disappeared from the files." She paused, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. The man matched the description of Tom McCall. Roberto said he seemed frustrated, like someone had gotten to the records before him. This information painted an even darker picture. Not only had Tom discovered the forgeries, but Crane's people had been systematically destroying evidence that could expose their scheme. They were covering their tracks with the thoroughness of professional criminals, which suggested resources and organization beyond what a simple land-grabbing operation would require. "There's more," Elena continued. "Roberto also said there's been talk in the territorial capital about irregularities in mineral rights claims. Someone's been filing paperwork for mining operations on land that's supposed to be protected, using survey maps that don't match the official territorial records. Mining rights. That added another dimension to the conspiracy. This wasn't just about acquiring farmland. It was about gaining control of mineral deposits that could be worth millions. And if they were willing to forge territorial documents and eliminate a deputy sheriff to protect that secret, they wouldn't hesitate to escalate their tactics against anyone else who threatened their operation. That evening, as Boone helped Josie with her arithmetic lessons while Sarah mended clothes by lamplight, he found himself studying the domestic scene with new eyes. The quiet contentment of the little house, the unconscious way Sarah hummed while she worked, Josie's tongue poking out in concentration as she struggled with division problems, all of it felt precious and fragile, like something that could be shattered by the forces gathering in the darkness outside. "Mr. Boone," Josie said suddenly, looking up from her slate, "are the bad men going to come back?" The question hit him like a punch to the chest. Children had a way of cutting straight to the heart of adult worries, stripping away all the careful euphemisms and diplomatic language to expose the raw truth underneath. "I don't know, honey," he said honestly. "But if they do, I'll be here. Promise?" The word hung in the air between them, heavy with trust and hope, and the kind of faith that children placed in adults who had proven themselves worthy. Boone looked at her serious green eyes, so much like her mother's, and felt the full weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "I promise," he said. But even as he spoke the words, he was thinking about the forged documents hidden in his saddlebags, about Tom McCall's fate, and about the kind of men who would destroy families to protect their illegal profits. Promising to protect them was easy. Keeping that promise might cost him everything. Later that night, after Sarah and Josie had gone to bed, Boone sat on the front porch cleaning his weapons with the methodical precision of a man who understood that preparation was the difference between life and death. The Colt revolver that rode on his hip, the Winchester rifle he kept by his bedroll, the knife in his boot, all of them were tools he had hoped never to need again, but which circumstance seemed determined to force back into his hands. As he worked, he became aware of movement in the darkness beyond the reach of the porch light, not close enough to represent immediate danger, but close enough to make his presence known. Crane's watchers were getting bolder, their surveillance becoming more obvious and intimidating. Let them watch, Boone thought again. Let them see him sitting calmly on the porch, cleaning his guns with the unhurried confidence of a man who had faced worse odds and survived. Sometimes the best way to deter an attack was to make it clear that you were ready for one. But as he slid the cleaned Colt back into its holster, Boone couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a precipice. The forged documents had revealed the true scope of Crane's operation, but they had also made it clear that the stakes were higher than he had initially realized. This wasn't just about protecting one family from intimidation. It was about exposing a conspiracy that could destroy an entire community. And somewhere in the darkness, men with no conscience and unlimited resources were making their own plans, calculating their own odds, and deciding how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. The photograph had been tucked between the pages of Boone's journal for so long that the edges had begun to yellow and curl. He discovered it missing one morning when he went to record his observations about Crane's surveillance patterns, and his heart nearly stopped when he realized where it must have fallen. Sarah found it while sweeping the kitchen floor, the small, sepia-toned image face up beneath the table where it had slipped from his journal during the previous evening's discussion of their defensive plans. She held it carefully, studying the faces of the woman and small boy captured in formal pose, and when Boone entered the kitchen seeking his morning coffee, she looked up with understanding and compassion in her eyes. "They're beautiful," she said simply, offering the photograph back to him. "Your family?" Boone's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he took the picture, his thumb tracing the familiar faces with the gentle touch of a man handling something infinitely precious and irretrievably lost. "My wife, Clara, and my son, David." He would have been about Josie's age now. The past tense hung heavy between them, and Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to deep sympathy. "What happened to them?" For a long moment, Boone said nothing, his eyes fixed on the photograph as if he could will the figures to move, to breathe, to step out of the sepia world and back into his life. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain that had never properly healed. "Cholera outbreak in a mining town called Silver Creek, up in Montana Territory. I was away on business security work for a mining company that was having trouble with claim jumpers. Planned to be gone 2 weeks, but the job ran long, turned into a month." He paused, his jaw working as he forced himself to continue. "By the time I got back, half the town was dead or dying. Clara and David were already buried in the hillside cemetery." Sarah's hand went to her heart, a gesture of instinctive maternal sympathy. "Oh, Boone, I'm so sorry. I should have been there," he continued, the words coming now like water through a broken dam. "Should have taken them with me, or finished the job faster, or just said no when the company asked me to extend the contract. But I thought I was doing the right thing, providing for them, building something for our future." His laugh was bitter and self-recriminating. Future, as if we were guaranteed one. The confession seemed to drain something from him, leaving his shoulders sagged and his eyes distant with memory. It was Sarah who broke the silence, her voice gentle but firm. "You couldn't have known. Nobody could have predicted an outbreak like that." "Maybe not," Boone agreed. "But I've spent the last 8 years thinking about all the ways it could have been different. All the choices I could have made that would have meant coming home to my family instead of to 2 graves on a hillside." Now Sarah understood the depth of his commitment to protecting them, the intensity with which he approached every threat against their small family. He wasn't just repaying a debt of gratitude, he was trying to atone for a failure that haunted him, trying to save a family because he hadn't been able to save his own. "Is that why you became," she gestured vaguely, searching for the right words, "a gunfighter? A man with a reputation for violence?" Boone supplied the words she was too polite to speak. "Partly. After I lost them, I stopped caring much about my own survival. That makes a man dangerous in ways that careful living never could. When you're not afraid to die, other people become afraid of you." He tucked the photograph back into his journal with the reverent care of a man handling a religious relic. "But mostly I became what I am because the world taught me that good people need protecting, and sometimes the only protection that works is the willingness to meet violence with violence." The conversation was interrupted by Josie's entrance into the kitchen, her hair tousled from sleep and her bare feet making soft sounds on the wooden floor. She looked between the two adults, her sharp child's instincts picking up on the emotional weight in the room. "Are you sad about something, Mr. Boone?" she asked, with the direct concern of a child who had learned to read adult moods for signs of danger or distress. Boone knelt down to her level, his large hands gentle as they smoothed her tangled hair. "I was telling your mama about some people I used to know. Sometimes, when you miss people very much, it makes you a little sad, even when you're talking about good memories." Josie considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher, like how Mama gets sad when she looks at Papa's chair, but she still sits in it sometimes because it makes her feel close to him. "Exactly like that," Boone agreed, glancing at Sarah with new understanding. They were both carrying the weight of loss, both trying to protect what remained while honoring what was gone. As the day progressed, the shared revelation seemed to deepen the bond between the three of them. Sarah moved with a new awareness of Boone's motivation, her interactions with him colored by understanding of the pain that drove his fierce protectiveness. And Boone found himself watching Josie with even greater intensity, seeing in her curious spirit and fearless heart an echo of the son he would never watch grow up. But the outside world wouldn't wait for them to process their emotional connections. That afternoon brought news that escalated the conflict to a new level of urgency. Elena Vasquez rode out to the homestead with information that turned their defensive planning from theoretical to immediate necessity. "Roberto sent word from Cheyenne," she reported, accepting Sarah's offer of coffee with hands that shook slightly with urgency. "The territorial marshal is coming to investigate the missing deputy sheriff. Someone in the capital finally noticed that Tom McCall never filed his regular reports, and they're sending Marshal Harrison to look into it." This should have been good news, but Elena's expression suggested otherwise. "The problem is, Marshal Harrison is honest. He'll actually investigate, follow leads, ask uncomfortable questions, and word is that he's planning to start by interviewing Tom's family." The implications hit Boone immediately. If Harrison was truly honest and competent, his investigation might expose Crane's entire operation. But that same investigation would also put the McCall family at the center of a territorial legal proceeding, making them visible to powerful enemies who preferred to operate in shadows. "When is Harrison expected to arrive?" Boone asked. 3 days, maybe 4, if the weather turns bad." Elena's eyes met his with grim understanding, "which means Crane's people have 3 days to either flee the territory or eliminate anyone who might provide testimony against them." 1. Sarah's face had gone white as she grasped the full danger of their situation. "You think they'll try to kill us before the marshal arrives?" "I think they'll try to make the problem disappear," Boone said carefully. "Whether that means threatening you into silence, discrediting your testimony, or something more permanent depends on how desperate they are and how much they think you know." The weight of the forged documents in his saddlebags felt suddenly heavier. Those papers represented evidence that could destroy Crane's operation and send powerful men to prison, but they also represented a death sentence for anyone found possessing them. That evening, as they made final preparations for what might be a siege, Boone found himself thinking about the photograph in his journal. Clara and David stared out from the sepia world with expressions of trust and love, as if they were depending on him to make the right choices this time, to be present when he was needed most. He had failed his own family through absence and misplaced priorities. He wouldn't make the same mistake with the family that had chosen to trust him. Whatever came in the next few days, he would be here, ready and willing to pay whatever price was necessary to keep them safe. The town's original charter was discovered in the most unlikely of places, inside a hollowed-out Bible that had belonged to Sweetwater Springs' founding minister. Josie found it while exploring the abandoned church on the hill above town, her natural curiosity leading her to investigate the old leather-bound book that sat alone on the altar. The document was written in the careful copperplate handwriting of territorial clerks, dated 1869, and bore the official seal of the Wyoming Territory. But more importantly, it contained specific language about mineral rights and land use that directly contradicted the forged surveys Crane's people had been using to justify their claims. "This changes everything," Boone said, studying the charter by lamplight, while Sarah and Josie looked on. "According to this, any mineral rights on homesteaded land belong to the homesteaders themselves, not to outside mining interests. And look here, it specifically protects family claims that have been continuously worked for more than 5 years." Sarah leaned closer, her finger tracing the relevant passage. "That would cover our land and the Vasquez Ranch and most of the established homesteads in the valley. It would also explain why Crane's people were so eager to get Tom out of the way." Boone observed grimly. If a territorial deputy had presented this charter as evidence against their forged claims, their entire operation would have collapsed. The discovery gave them legal ammunition, but it also escalated their danger. The charter was proof of fraud on a massive scale, evidence that could send men to prison and cost others millions in illegal profits. In the wrong hands, it was a death warrant for anyone who possessed it. Over the next 2 days, Boone worked quietly to organize the valley's scattered homesteaders into something resembling a defensive network. It was delicate work, requiring him to identify families who could be trusted while avoiding those who might already be compromised by fear or financial pressure. Marcus Brennan, a former cavalry sergeant who ran a small horse ranch, became an unexpected ally. His military experience and natural leadership made him valuable for coordinating defensive positions, and his ranch's location at the north end of the valley gave him a clear view of the main approaches from town. "I've been watching Crane's people for weeks," Brennan reported during a clandestine meeting at the old church. "They've been mapping every homestead, counting livestock, noting defensive positions. This isn't random intimidation, they're planning something systematic." Elena Vasquez brought news that was equally disturbing. Her contacts in town reported that Crane had been recruiting additional men, bringing in hard cases from as far away as Denver and Kansas City. The kind of men who solve problems with bullets rather than legal documents. "My nephew saw them practicing with rifles behind the hotel," she said. 20 men, maybe more, all armed with new weapons and plenty of ammunition. That's not a security detail, that's a small army. The implications were chilling. Crane wasn't planning to wait for the territorial marshal's investigation. He was preparing to eliminate the witnesses, destroy the evidence, and present Marshal Harrison with a valley full of tragic accidents and mysterious disappearances. But Boone's most valuable intelligence came from an unexpected source. Young Roberto Vasquez had managed to intercept a telegram intended for Crane, and the message confirmed their worst fears. Marshal Harrison delayed by weather. Stop window extended 3 days. Stop clean house. Before arrival, stop authorization granted for final solution. Stop. The telegram was unsigned, but its meaning was clear. Someone with authority, possibly territorial officials, possibly Crane's mysterious employers, had given permission for wholesale murder to protect the conspiracy. That evening, as they finalized their defensive preparations, Sarah pulled Boone aside for a conversation that had been building between them for days. The growing affection that had developed alongside their shared danger could no longer be ignored, even with death potentially hours away. "Boone," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I need you to know something. Whatever happens tomorrow, these weeks with you have meant more to me than I can properly express. You've given us hope when we had none, protection when we were defenseless." And she paused, searching for words. "You've reminded me that there are still good men in the world." Boone felt his heart constrict with emotion and possibility. "Sarah, I know about your wife and son," she continued. "And I know you think helping us is somehow about making amends for not being there when they needed you. But what you've done for Josie and me, the way you've become part of our family, that's not about guilt or obligation. That's about love." The word hung between them like a bridge across a chasm, dangerous and necessary and beautiful. Boone reached out to touch her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her soft skin. "I came here as a stranger," he said quietly. "A man with nothing but regrets and a reputation for violence. But you and Josie, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. You've given me a reason to be better than I was." Their kiss was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as weeks of unspoken feeling found expression. When they finally separated, both were breathing hard, and the world seemed charged with new possibility. "After this is over," Sarah whispered, "after we've dealt with Crane and the marshal has come and gone, what then?" Boone considered the question seriously. "Then we build something," he said, "something permanent and good. A life together, if you'll have me, a family, and if we don't survive tomorrow? Then at least we'll have had this moment," Boone replied, "and Josie will know that there were people who cared enough about her to fight for her future." Their romantic moment was interrupted by a soft sound from the kitchen doorway. Josie stood there in her nightgown, watching them with the solemn expression of a child who understood more than adults gave her credit for. "Are you going to marry Mama?" she asked with characteristic directness. Boone and Sarah exchanged glances, both touched and amused by her matter-of-fact approach to their developing relationship. "Would you like that?" Sarah asked her daughter. Josie considered the question with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. "I think Papa would like Mr. Boone," she said finally, "and I think Mr. Boone makes you smile more than you have since Papa went away. So yes, I would like that very much." The simple acceptance in her voice moved Boone more than any formal blessing could have. This child, who had saved his life and trusted him with her family's safety, was offering him something precious beyond measure, the chance to be not just a protector, but a father. Later that night, as they made final preparations for what would likely be Crane's assault, Boone found himself thinking about the strange turns that life could take. He had come to this valley as a drifter with no destination and no purpose beyond surviving one more day. Now he had a family to protect, a future to fight for, and the kind of stakes that made courage not just possible, but inevitable. Tomorrow would bring violence and danger and possibly death. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Boone Maddox had something worth living for. The charter tucked safely in his saddlebags represented more than legal evidence. It represented the foundation of a new life, a document that could secure not just justice for the valley's homesteaders, but a future for the family he had found in the most unlikely of circumstances. The letter arrived at dawn, carried by a rider who approached the homestead with a white flag tied to his rifle barrel. Boone met him at the gate with his gun drawn but not raised, recognizing the universal symbol of truce, even while suspecting treachery. The rider was young, perhaps 17, with the nervous energy of someone who knew he was carrying dangerous information into hostile territory. "You Boone Maddox?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly with tension. "I am. Got a message for the McCall family, from someone who says he's the girl's father." The words hit Boone like a physical blow. He took the letter with hands that weren't quite steady, noting the familiar handwriting on the envelope handwriting he had seen on official documents in the house, on notes left for Sarah, on the margins of Josie's schoolbooks, where a loving father had written encouragement. Tom McCall was alive. Inside the house, Sarah's reaction to the letter was everything Boone had expected and feared. Joy, relief, anger and terror warred across her face as she read her husband's words, written in the careful script of a man who knew his message might be his last. "My dearest Sarah and Josie," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my fears about Crane's operation have proven justified, and my investigation has put our family in danger. I am writing this from a cell beneath Crane's warehouse in Cheyenne, where I have been held prisoner for the past 3 months. I want you to know that I am unharmed, though Crane's people have made it clear that my continued health depends on your cooperation. They have told me about the pressure they have been putting on you to sell our land and about the stranger who has been helping to protect you. I pray that this man, whoever he is, will continue to keep you safe, because I fear my situation is about to become much worse. Crane has discovered that a territorial marshal is coming to investigate my disappearance. He has decided that loose ends must be eliminated before the investigation can proceed. Sarah, my love, I need you to understand what I am about to tell you. Crane's operation is not just about land fraud. He is the front man for a group of territorial politicians and mining executives who have been systematically stealing mineral rights across 3 territories. The scope of their crimes is staggering: millions of dollars in illegal profits, dozens of families destroyed, and at least 4 other lawmen who have disappeared while investigating irregularities. I have been kept alive because Crane hoped to use me as leverage against any investigation. But with Marshal Harrison's arrival imminent, I have become more liability than asset. Crane plans to stage my escape and subsequent death, making it appear that I was killed while resisting recapture. This will explain my long absence while eliminating any possibility of testimony against his organization. However, Crane has made one crucial mistake. He has underestimated the resourcefulness of his prisoners and the loyalty of those who work for him. The young man carrying this letter is the son of one of Crane's guards, a man who has grown disgusted with his employer's methods and is willing to risk everything to help me escape. The plan is simple but dangerous. Tonight, during the confusion of Crane's assault on our homestead, yes, my darling, they are coming for you. I will escape from my cell and attempt to reach you with evidence that will destroy Crane's entire operation. But the timing must be perfect, and the cooperation complete. Sarah, the man who has been protecting you, I believe his name is Boone Maddox, is our only hope of survival. You must trust him completely, follow his instructions without question, and be prepared to fight for our family's life. Tell Josie that her papa is coming home and that he loves her more than all the stars in the Wyoming sky. If I do not survive what is coming, please know that every day I have spent loving you and Josie has been worth any price I might pay. Protect our daughter, trust in God's providence, and remember that love is stronger than fear. Your devoted husband and father, Thomas McCall. P.S. Sarah, I have hidden something important in the place where we carved our initials on our wedding day. If anything happens to me, Boone will need what is hidden there to finish what I started. The letter fell from Sarah's nerveless fingers as the full implications sank in. Tom was alive, but trapped. Crane was planning to kill him during a staged escape. And somewhere in Cheyenne, a complex plan was already in motion that would either save their family or destroy it completely. Josie, who had been listening with the focused attention of a child who understood that her world was about to change dramatically, spoke into the silence. "Where did you and Papa carve your initials, Mama?" Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. The old cottonwood by the river, the one where she stopped, her face flushing with memory and sudden comprehension. Boone was already moving toward the door. "Show me." The tree stood 50 yards from the riverbank, its massive trunk scarred by decades of wind and weather. The initials TM plus SM were carved in a heart-shaped outline about 6 feet from the ground, the bark beginning to heal around the edges but still clearly visible. Below them, almost hidden by the natural texture of the bark, was a small cavity that had been carefully concealed. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a packet of documents that made the forged deeds look like child's play. These were the original records Tom had discovered in the Territorial Office survey maps, mineral rights claims, and correspondence between territorial officials and Mountain Territory development that proved corruption reaching to the highest levels of government. But more than that, they contained a complete organizational chart of Crane's operation, including names, dates, and financial records that would be enough to bring down not just Crane, but his employers and political allies as well. Tom McCall had been building a case that would expose one of the largest criminal conspiracies in territorial history. "This is why they couldn't let him live," Boone said grimly, studying the documents. This isn't just evidence of land fraud, it's proof of a criminal enterprise that reaches into territorial government, federal land offices, and major mining corporations. If this gets to Marshall Harrison, it would destroy dozens of careers and cost millions in illegal profits, Sarah finished. No wonder they were willing to kill to protect it. But the documents also revealed something else, the exact location where Tom was being held, the layout of Crane's Cheyenne operation, and the timing of the planned assault on their homestead. Tom's letter had been more than a message of love and warning. It had been an intelligence report from behind enemy lines. "Look at this," Boone said, pointing to a map included with the documents. "Tom has marked guard positions, patrol schedules, and what looks like a detailed escape route. He's been planning this for weeks, maybe months." The realization transformed their situation from desperate defense to coordinated rescue operation. Instead of simply trying to survive Crane's assault, they now had the opportunity to coordinate their defense with Tom's escape, potentially catching Crane's forces between two groups of armed defenders. But it also meant accepting enormous risk. If Tom's escape attempt failed, or if their timing was off, the entire plan would collapse, leaving both families exposed to Crane's vengeance. And if Crane suspected that his prisoner had managed to communicate with his family, he might abandon his careful plans in favor of immediate and brutal retaliation. "Mama," Josie said quietly, her small hand gripping the letter as if it were a lifeline, "when Papa comes home, will the bad men stop trying to hurt us?" Sarah knelt down to her daughter's level, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. When Papa comes home, and when Marshall Harrison sees the evidence we have, the bad men will go to jail where they belong." But Boone was studying the documents with the calculating eye of a man who understood that hope and reality didn't always align. Tom's plan was brilliant and detailed, but it depended on perfect timing, flawless execution, and a level of coordination that would be difficult to achieve under the best circumstances. And they were rapidly running out of time. According to Tom's letter, Crane's assault would begin at nightfall, giving them less than 12 hours to prepare not just for defense, but for the most complex and dangerous operation any of them had ever attempted. The letter that had brought such joy and hope also carried with it the weight of enormous responsibility. They were no longer just fighting for their own survival, they were fighting to save Tom McCall, expose a massive criminal conspiracy, and deliver justice for all the families who had been destroyed by Crane's greed. As evening approached and they made final preparations for what would be the most important night of their lives, Boone found himself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. He had come to the valley as a broken man, seeking nothing but survival. Now he was about to risk everything for a family that had become more precious to him than his own life, and for a cause that was larger than any individual's survival. Tom McCall's letter had changed everything. The question now was whether they would all live long enough to see the justice they were fighting for. The cavalry sword had belonged to Boone's father, carried through the Civil War and passed down with stories of honor, duty, and the terrible weight of necessary violence. Boone had never expected to draw it again, but as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, he found himself checking the blade's edge with the reverent attention of a man preparing for his final stand. The weapon was more than steel and leather. It was a symbol of everything his father had taught him about standing for what was right, even when the cost was unbearable. Colonel James Maddox had died at Gettysburg with that sword in his hand, leading a desperate cavalry charge that had saved hundreds of lives at the cost of his own. Now his son would carry it into a different kind of battle, but one that mattered just as much. "It's beautiful," Sarah said quietly, watching him wrap the sword in an oiled cloth before securing it to his saddle. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so," Boone replied. "I hope they both would be proud, my father and Tom. Strange how a man's life can circle back on itself. I spent 8 years running from responsibility, from connection, from the kind of fight that requires you to stand for something bigger than your own survival. Now here I am, preparing to risk everything for people I've known less than a month. But that wasn't quite true, and they both knew it. He had known Sarah and Josie for weeks, but he felt as if he had been waiting his entire life to find them. The love that had grown between them wasn't measured in days or months, it was measured in moments of trust, acts of courage, and the gradual healing of wounds that both had thought would never mend. The tactical situation was complex beyond anything Boone had faced, even during his years as a territorial peace officer. According to Tom's intelligence, Crane would attack the homestead with approximately 20 men, expecting to find a defenseless family and perhaps one stubborn protector. What he would actually encounter was a coordinated defense involving not just Boone, but Marcus Brennan and 6 other homesteaders who had finally decided that running was no longer an option. The homestead itself had been transformed into a fortress over the past week. Windows had been boarded and reinforced with carefully calculated firing ports that would allow defenders to cover all approaches. The barn had been prepared as a fallback position, with supplies and ammunition cached for a prolonged siege. And the root cellar had been expanded into a secure hiding place where Sarah and Josie could take shelter if the house became untenable. But the real complexity lay in coordinating their defense with Tom's escape attempt. According to his letter, Tom planned to break free from his Cheyenne prison at precisely the moment Crane's assault began, when most of the gang leaders' attention would be focused on the homestead attack. He would then ride hard for home, carrying evidence that could destroy the entire conspiracy. The timing had to be perfect. If Tom escaped too early, Crane might abort the attack and flee with his remaining men. If he escaped too late, he might arrive to find his family dead and his evidence meaningless. And if his escape attempt failed entirely, Boone and the others would be facing 20 armed men with no hope of reinforcement. Elena Vasquez arrived at sunset, with final intelligence from her network of contacts. "Crane's men are gathering at the old Peterson place," she reported. "My nephew counted 19 riders, all heavily armed. They're planning to attack just after full dark, probably around 10 o'clock. She paused, her weathered face grim with additional news. "There's something else." Roberto intercepted another telegram. "Marshal Harrison isn't delayed by weather. He's been deliberately misdirected by someone in the territorial office. He's currently investigating a false report of Indian troubles 200 miles south of here." The news confirmed what they had already suspected. Crane's corruption reached deep into territorial government. Someone with authority had ensured that help would not arrive in time to interfere with the planned massacre. "How long before Harrison realizes he's been sent on a wild goose chase?" Boone asked. "Roberto thinks 3 days, maybe 4, long enough for Crane to finish his business here and disappear," which meant they were truly on their own. No help was coming from territorial law enforcement. No cavalry charge would arrive at the last moment to save them. They would stand or fall based on their own courage, preparation, and the desperate hope that Tom McCall's plan would work. As darkness settled over the valley, Boone made final rounds to check defensive positions. Marcus Brennan had positioned himself in the barn loft, with a clear field of fire across the yard. 2 other homesteaders were concealed in the root cellar entrance, ready to provide covering fire for anyone who needed to retreat. The remaining defenders were scattered around the property perimeter, each with specific assignments and fallback positions. Inside the house, Sarah was loading rifles with the calm efficiency of a woman who had accepted that violence was sometimes the only answer to violence. Her hands were steady as she pressed cartridges into cylinders, but Boone could see the cost of this composure in the tight lines around her eyes. "I keep thinking about Tom's letter," she said without looking up from her work. "About how he said love is stronger than fear. Do you think that's true?" Boone considered the question seriously. "I think love gives us reasons to overcome fear," he said finally. "Fear is about losing what matters. Love is about protecting what matters. When those two forces meet, love has to win, or nothing else makes sense." Josie emerged from the bedroom carrying her father's deputy badge, the tarnished metal polished to a dull shine. "I want to keep this with me," she said, pinning it carefully to her dress. "So Papa will know I remembered what he taught me about being brave." The sight of the child preparing for battle with such serious determination broke something inside Boone's chest. She was 9 years old. She should be worried about arithmetic lessons and chicken feed, not gunfights and family survival. But the frontier had a way of accelerating childhood, forcing children to face adult realities before they were ready. "Your papa is going to be so proud of you," Boone told her, kneeling down to adjust the badge so it sat properly. "And so am I." At 9:30, they received the signal they had been waiting for. A single gunshot echoed across the valley from the direction of town, the sound Tom had specified in his letter to indicate that his escape attempt had begun. From this moment forward, everything depended on timing, courage, and the kind of luck that good people sometimes received when they needed it most. Boone took his position at the main window, the cavalry sword at his side and his rifle ready. Sarah and Josie retreated to their designated shelter, though he could see that both would emerge fighting if the situation became desperate. Around the property, their allies settled into position with the quiet intensity of people who understood that the next few hours would determine not just their own fate, but the future of their entire community. The waiting was the hardest part. In the distance, they could hear the sound of approaching horses, not the casual clip-clop of travelers, but the purposeful thunder of men riding to war. Crane was coming with his hired killers, expecting to find easy victims, and instead walking into a carefully prepared trap. Boone thought about the photograph in his journal, about Clara and David watching from beyond the grave. He thought about his father's sword and the legacy of honor it represented. Most of all, he thought about the family he had found in this remote valley and the future they could build together if they survived the night. The sound of horses grew louder, and Boone could see torches moving through the darkness, Crane's men spreading out to surround the property. They moved with professional precision, these hired killers, but they were expecting to face a lone gunman and a frightened family. They had no idea they were walking into a coordinated defense prepared by people who had everything to lose and nothing left to fear. As the first shouts erupted from the darkness and muzzle flashes began to light up the night, Boone offered a silent prayer to whatever force governed the fate of good people in a violent world. Let Tom's escape succeed. Let their defense hold. Let this night end with justice served and family reunited. Then the shooting began in earnest, and there was no time for prayer, only for the deadly work of protecting the people he loved. The jail cell key was smaller than Tom McCall had expected, a simple piece of iron that represented the difference between life and death, between justice and conspiracy, between a father returning to his family and a family destroyed by greed. He held it carefully as his unlikely ally, the guard's son named Billy, led him through the darkened corridors of Crane's warehouse complex. "Stay close and stay quiet," Billy whispered, his young face pale with terror and determination. "Papa said there are 2 guards at the main door, but they'll be watching the road, not expecting trouble from inside." Tom nodded, testing his legs after 3 months of confinement. His muscles were weak but willing, and the thought of seeing Sarah and Josie again gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. More importantly, the packet of additional evidence he had managed to compile during his imprisonment, guard schedules, financial records, correspondence between Crane and his political allies was secured inside his shirt, adding to the documentation that would destroy the conspiracy. They moved through the warehouse like ghosts, past stacks of mining equipment and forged documents, past the machinery of corruption that had destroyed so many lives. Tom's lawman instincts catalogued everything he saw, building a case that would satisfy even the most skeptical territorial judge. The sound of gunfire erupted in the distance the attack on his homestead had begun. Tom's heart clenched with fear for his family, but he forced himself to focus on the immediate task. Boone Maddox would protect them. The stranger, who had somehow become their guardian, would stand between his family and harm. Tom had to believe that, had to trust in the character assessment he had made based on Sarah's carefully worded letters and Josie's enthusiastic descriptions. "There," Billy pointed toward a side door that opened onto the loading dock. "Papa left 2 horses tied behind the grain warehouse, fast ones, and they know the road to Sweetwater Springs." But as they approached the door, Tom heard voices that made his blood run cold. Crane's voice, speaking to someone with the casual confidence of a man who believed his plans were proceeding perfectly. "Should be over within the hour. Maddox is good, but he's 1 man against 20. When it's finished, we'll have eliminated the threats and can present Marshal Harrison with a tragic tale of family conflict and unfortunate violence." "And McCall?" The second voice belonged to someone Tom didn't recognize, someone whose authority seemed to equal or exceed Crane's. "McCall will die trying to escape, just as we planned. His body will be found along the road to Sweetwater Springs, apparently killed while fleeing justice. It will explain his long absence and eliminate the last witness to our operations." Tom felt Billy tense beside him, the young man's fear almost palpable. But Tom's own fear was transforming into something harder and more dangerous, the cold anger of a lawman who had seen too much corruption, a husband whose family was under attack, a father who would do anything to protect his child. The conversation continued, revealing details that made Tom's evidence even more damning. Names of territorial officials involved in the conspiracy, specific amounts of money that had changed hands, plans for expanding the operation into neighboring territories. Every word was another nail in the coffin of Crane's criminal enterprise. But they also revealed something more immediate and terrifying. Crane had no intention of letting Tom escape and die accidentally. He planned to execute him personally, then stage the scene to support his cover story. The escape route Tom had planned was actually a trap, designed to lead him into an ambush where Crane could eliminate him safely. Billy seemed to understand the situation as well, his whispered words barely audible. "The back door, it's watched too. Papa said if something went wrong, we should go through the root cellar. There's a tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft." Tom nodded, following the young man's lead as they changed direction. The tunnel was cramped and dark, but it offered concealment and an unexpected exit. As they crawled through the narrow space, Tom could hear Crane's men moving through the warehouse above, searching for their escaped prisoner. The mine shaft exit was concealed by brush and debris, opening onto a hillside that overlooked the warehouse complex. From here, Tom could see the horses Billy had mentioned, still tied behind the grain warehouse, but now clearly visible to guards who had been alerted to their escape. "We'll have to make a run for it," Tom whispered. "When I give the signal, we go fast and we don't stop." But Billy shook his head, his young face resolute with decision. "No, sir. You go. I'll create a distraction, give you time to reach the horses." "Son, I can't let you." "My papa is risking everything to help you," Billy interrupted. "This is my part. Besides, they won't hurt me. I'm just a kid who got scared and ran." Before Tom could protest further, Billy was moving, deliberately making noise as he scrambled down the hillside in the opposite direction. Shouts erupted from the warehouse as guards spotted the movement, and Tom heard Crane's voice bellowing orders for pursuit. In the confusion that followed, Tom reached the horses and mounted quickly, his lawman's training taking over as he assessed routes and risks. The road to Sweetwater Springs stretched before him, and somewhere along that road, his family was fighting for their lives. As he rode hard into the night, the jail cell key still clutched in his hand, Tom McCall offered a prayer for the brave young man who had sacrificed his own safety to ensure the truth would survive. Behind him, the warehouse complex blazed with torchlight as Crane's men searched for their escaped prisoner. Ahead lay 30 miles of dangerous territory and a family reunion that might end in tragedy or triumph. The key had unlocked more than just a prison cell. It had unlocked the possibility of justice, the hope of family reunion, and the chance to finish what he had started 3 months ago. Whether that chance would be enough depended on courage, luck, and the stranger named Boone Maddox, who had chosen to stand between evil and innocence. The Sweetwater River Bridge had been built by the territory to accommodate wagon traffic, but on this night it became a battlefield where the fate of an entire valley would be decided. The wooden structure spanning the rushing water was the only practical crossing point for miles in either direction, making it a natural choke point that Boone had incorporated into his defensive strategy. As Crane's men pressed their attack on the homestead, Boone found himself forced to make the hardest decision of the night. Their defensive positions were holding, but barely. Marcus Brennan was wounded in the barn loft, Elena Vasquez was pinned down behind the chicken coop, and ammunition was running low. Worst of all, there was still no sign of Tom McCall. "Sarah," Boone called over the gunfire, "we need to fall back to the secondary position." It was the plan they had hoped never to implement, a fighting retreat to the river bridge, where they could make a final stand with the water at their backs. The bridge offered excellent defensive advantages, but it also cut off their escape routes. If Tom didn't arrive soon, with reinforcements or evidence compelling enough to stop the attack, they would be trapped. The retreat was a masterpiece of desperation and coordination. Marcus Brennan, despite his wounded arm, provided covering fire from the barn as the other defenders leapfrogged backward toward the river. Sarah and Josie moved with the quick efficiency of people who had rehearsed this nightmare scenario, carrying essential supplies and the precious documents that represented their only hope of legal victory. Boone brought up the rear, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy as Crane's men attempted to rush their positions. 3 attackers lay motionless in the yard, testament to his marksmanship, but the remaining 17 were regrouping for a final assault that would overwhelm their diminished defenses. At the bridge, they took positions behind the stone abutments and wooden railings, turning the structure into an improvised fortress. The river rushed beneath them, its sound masking their whispered communications as they prepared for what might be their last stand. "How much ammunition do we have left?" Boone asked quietly. Elena checked her remaining cartridges with grim efficiency. "Maybe 20 rounds between all of us. Enough for one more fight, if we make every shot count." It was then that Josie, crouched behind her mother with her father's deputy badge gleaming on her dress, spotted movement on the far side of the bridge. "Someone's coming," she whispered urgently. "A rider coming fast." Through the darkness, they could see a lone horseman approaching at a gallop, and Boone felt his heart sink. One of Crane's men had circled around to attack them from behind, trapping them completely on the bridge. But as the rider drew closer, Sarah's gasp of recognition cut through their despair like a blade of hope. "Tom! It's Tom!" Deputy Tom McCall rode onto the bridge like an avenging angel, his badge gleaming in the moonlight and his rifle ready for battle. He was thinner than when he had left, marked by months of imprisonment, but his eyes burned with the fierce determination of a man who had come home to protect his family. "Sarah! Josie!" he called out, dismounting and taking cover behind the bridge supports. "I have evidence that will end this." The reunion was brief but intense. Sarah and Tom's embrace, Josie throwing herself into her father's arms, and Boone's respectful nod to the man whose family he had been protecting. There would be time for longer conversations later if they survived the next few minutes. "Crane's finished," Tom reported quickly, pulling out the documents he had secured during his escape. "I have financial records, correspondence with territorial officials, and testimony from 3 other prisoners who were being held to prevent their testimony. When Marshal Harrison sees this, Crane and his entire organization will face federal charges." But their celebration was cut short by the sound of approaching horses. Crane himself was leading the final assault, having realized that his careful plans were unraveling. The gang leader's face was twisted with rage as he spotted Tom among the defenders, understanding that his prisoner's escape had doomed the entire operation. "McCall!" Crane shouted across the water. "You've caused me considerable trouble, but it ends here, tonight, with all of you at the bottom of the river." The final battle began with a fury that matched the river's current. Crane's men attacked from both ends of the bridge, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and firepower. But the bridge's narrow confines worked against them, forcing them to approach in small groups that could be dealt with by concentrated fire. Boone found himself fighting beside the man whose family he had protected, their movements coordinated by shared purpose and mutual respect. Tom was everything Boone had hoped, a skilled lawman, a devoted father, and a man worthy of Sarah's love and Josie's faith. The turning point came when Josie, crouched behind her parents, spotted Crane attempting to climb under the bridge to attack them from below. Without hesitation, she grabbed a loose stone from the bridge's construction and hurled it with the accuracy of a child who had spent years throwing rocks at tin cans. The stone struck Crane in the shoulder, causing him to lose his grip and fall into the rushing water below. The same river that had nearly claimed Boone's life now claimed the man who had threatened to destroy an entire community. As Crane's surviving men scattered into the night, leaderless and demoralized, the defenders found themselves standing victorious on the bridge, where it all began. The water that had brought Boone into their lives had now swept away their greatest enemy, completing a circle that felt like destiny. In the aftermath, as they tended wounds and counted costs, Tom placed his hand on Boone's shoulder with the gratitude of a man who understood what had been sacrificed for his family's safety. "I can never repay what you've done for them," Tom said simply. "You don't need to," Boone replied, looking at Sarah and Josie. "They gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. They gave me a family." The bridge that had been their battlefield would become a symbol of their victory, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely alliances could triumph over the most overwhelming odds. And as the first light of dawn broke over the Wyoming territory, 4 people stood together on the wooden span, bound by courage, love, and the knowledge that some fights are worth everything you have to give. The new family Bible arrived on a supply wagon 3 months after the battle at the bridge, its leather binding still stiff with newness and its pages unmarked by the wear of daily use. Sarah had ordered it from a publisher in Denver, wanting something fresh and untainted by the violence that had marked their lives, something that could serve as the foundation for the new beginning they were building together. Marshal Harrison had arrived 2 weeks after Crane's defeat, his investigation swift and thorough, once presented with the overwhelming evidence Tom and Boone had compiled. The conspiracy reached even further than they had suspected. Territorial senators, federal land office officials, and mining executives from as far away as San Francisco were implicated in the scheme. The trials would continue for months, but the immediate threat to the valley's homesteaders was over. Crane's body had never been recovered from the Sweetwater River, though his surviving men had been captured and were facing lengthy prison sentences. The forged documents had been exposed as fraudulent, the legitimate land claims had been upheld, and compensation was being arranged for families who had been driven from their homes by intimidation and false legal proceedings. But for the extended family that now lived in the expanded McCall homestead, the legal victories were less important than the personal ones they celebrated each day. The house itself had been rebuilt and enlarged, with Tom and Boone working side by side to create a home large enough for the unusual family arrangement they had chosen. Tom had insisted that Boone remain as more than just a friend. He had seen the love between Boone and Sarah, had witnessed the bond between Boone and Josie, and had understood that some connections transcended conventional definitions of family. "A man who would die to protect my wife and daughter has earned a place at my table for as long as he wants it," Tom had declared, and that place had gradually evolved into something permanent and precious. The wedding had been a quiet affair, held in the rebuilt church with most of the valley's families in attendance. Not the wedding of Boone and Sarah. That ceremony would wait until Sarah felt ready to take such a step, but rather a ceremony of commitment and family formation that acknowledged the bonds they had all chosen to embrace. Tom had stood as Boone's witness as he formally adopted Josie, giving her the legal protection of his name while honoring Tom's role as her father. It was an arrangement that might have seemed strange to outsiders, but which felt perfectly natural to the people involved. Josie now had two fathers who loved her. Sarah had two men committed to her protection and happiness. And Tom had gained a brother whose loyalty had been tested under the most extreme circumstances. The new Bible would record these unconventional family connections, along with the more traditional ones that would hopefully follow. Sarah was pregnant, a development that had surprised and delighted all of them, and the child would be born into a family defined not by blood alone, but by choice, commitment, and love. As autumn settled over the valley, bringing with it the promise of a harsh but manageable winter, the four adults, for Josie, had earned her place among the decision-makers. Through her courage during the crisis, sat around the expanded kitchen table, planning for the future. Roberto Vasquez brought news from Cheyenne today, Tom reported, his law enforcement connections still providing valuable intelligence. The territorial legislature is considering new laws to prevent the kind of land fraud we dealt with. They want to make me the new territorial marshal in charge of investigating such schemes. It was an honor and an opportunity, but one that would require travel and time away from the family. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Tom's dedication to justice was being rewarded with a position that might again separate him from the people he loved most. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, her question directed at all of them. "I think," Boone said carefully, "that the territory needs honest lawmen, and Tom is as honest as they come. But I also think families need fathers, and Josie needs her papa." Josie, now 10 and growing rapidly toward young womanhood, had been listening with the serious attention she brought to all family discussions. "Could Mr. Boone go with you sometimes, Papa? As a deputy or something, then you wouldn't be alone, and Mama and the new baby wouldn't worry so much." The suggestion was typically practical and insightful. Boone had been considering what role he might play in their settled life, how a man with his skills and reputation could contribute to a peaceful community. Serving as deputy territorial marshal would allow him to use his abilities for justice while maintaining his connection to the family. "I'd be honored to serve with you," Boone told Tom, "if you think I'm suited for law enforcement work." Tom's smile was warm with affection and respect. "I think you're the most suited man I've ever met. Not because of your skill with weapons, but because of your judgment about when to use them and when to put them away." As if to emphasize the point, Boone's gun belt hung on a peg by the door, worn only when necessity demanded. The man who had once lived by violence had learned to live by choice, using force only when gentler methods failed and love required protection. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses, approaching not the threatening thunder that had marked Crane's attacks, but the measured pace of friendly visitors. Elena Vasquez and Marcus Brennan had come for their weekly dinner, part of the community gathering that had become traditional as the Valley's families grew closer in the aftermath of their shared crisis. As Sarah rose to prepare additional places at the table, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly, she paused to look around at the scene that had become her daily reality. Tom and Boone discussing law enforcement strategy with the easy camaraderie of true partners. Josie helping Elena shell beans while listening to stories about her grandmother's life in Mexico. Marcus teaching anyone who would listen about the proper care of horses. It was not the life she had imagined as a young bride, but it was a life richer and more complete than she had ever dared hope for. The violence that had brought them together was behind them, transformed into bonds of love and loyalty that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. Later that evening, as they gathered around the new Bible for their nightly reading, Boone reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He had come to this valley as a stranger, seeking nothing but survival, had been saved by the courage of a child, and transformed by the love of a family. The Bible's first entry, written in Sarah's careful hand, recorded the essential truth of their story. Sometimes God sends angels in unexpected forms, and sometimes salvation comes not from heaven, but from the willingness of ordinary people to show extraordinary kindness. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the cottonwoods, but inside the warm circle of lamplight, 4 people had found something more precious than gold or land or legal victory. They had found the kind of family that is built not by accident of birth, but by deliberate choice to love and protect and cherish what matters most. The little girl who had thrown a rope to a drowning stranger had saved more than one life that day. She had saved the possibility of hope, the promise of love, and the faith that even in the hardest places, good people can choose to make something beautiful together.